So the first major artist we're going to look at here is Leonardo da Vinci. Da Vinci comes up with a set of principles that many artists still use today. He was a polymath, a man who could do many things. He studied humans and animals through cadavers, fluid dynamics, weaponry, cartography, stage design, music composition, he played the flute, costume design, he designed a sewer system for the city of Milan. He was a painter, a sculptor, and an architect. He was also the illegitimate son of a notary, and he never mastered Latin or Greek. He was interested in the direct observation of the world. Here is one of Da Vinci's more famous paintings. It's called the Madonna of the Rocks. Da Vinci was one of the very first artists to come up with a set of principles that lots of people follow today. I mentioned that he was a polymath. That just means that he could do lots of different things. The Virgin of the Rocks is a typical painting in the Da Vinci style. It has an odd setting in the sense that when you look at this painting, you don't see a natural placement for the painting in terms of landscape. The background isn't something that you could walk outside of your door and say, oh, that's exactly what Leonardo was painting. The figures in the composition are having a sacred conversation, just like the slide that we looked at last lecture, the sacred conversation that Nani DeManco's Four Crowned Saints were having. Similar concept. The four figures here point at each other, they look at each other, they're talking to each other, they're communicating with each other, and the viewer is not part of that scenario. We see lots of humanism. This is Mary, but she looks just like a normal Florentine citizen. She wears rich colored clothing, nice colored clothing, but all at the same time very much a human being, and the babies are very baby-like. We see a new technique called sfumato, and I will dissect that a little bit more for you when we get to the Mona Lisa. But we also see sort of a light veil. And what I mean by that is you can see the light tends to catch the skin tones of the people, but the entire painting tends to have this like slight veil over top of it that keeps everything from being really sharp and crisp, which is a signature of Da Vinci's. This is Da Vinci's most iconic work, and probably one of the most famous works of art in the history of art, The Last Supper. It was created for a refectory in a monastery. A refectory is a place where the monks eat. It's sort of a dining hall in Milan, in Italy. It makes sense that it's a dining scene because it was in the place where the monks would dine, and what you're looking at is the exact moment after the Last Supper in which Jesus tells his disciples that one of them will betray him. And so they're all reacting to what Jesus had just said. You can see that the transversals and orthogonals all disappear or converge at the same point right in the center where Jesus sits. Michelangelo worked on this particular work of art for 3 years, and when he finished the painting, he actually had used an experiment. to create the fresco. So fresco typically is made of tempera and a water-based plaster paint, or water-based plaster and tempera. Tempera is egg-based, and so it mixes in well with the plaster. Unfortunately, DaVinci really wanted to use oils, but it needed to be part of the wall, and so he decided that he would try mixing the oil paints with the fresco material, or, yeah, with the plaster material for the fresco. It didn't work. It bubbled up, and the water in the plaster and the oil in the paint separated, and so he had to go back and refinish it several times. It's been restored a couple times, and so that restoration has brought about some interesting things in the history of art. Da Vinci's main goal here was to convey the inner intention of the man's soul. He felt like by creating characters that were highly emotional and showed great gesture, that he was giving the viewer an insight to the character's emotional and mental state. You can see that he groups all of the people in sets of threes. That is part of that idealism that he uses in terms of the Holy Trinity and the humanist concept of divine beings being here on earth. Jesus sits in the middle of the table. He has passed the bread. This is the moment in which we get the Eucharist ceremony from, where Jesus would have held up the bread and said, "Take and eat. This is my body given for you. Do this as often in remembrance of me." Then he would have picked up the chalice that had wine in it and said, "Take and drink. This is my blood of the new covenant, shed for you." And each person at the table would have drank. So he then gets in a discussion with his disciples and tells one of them that they would give up his identity to the Roman soldiers. And so they're all conversing about this. See if you can pick out the person that is Judas in this particular setting. That would be the person who gave Jesus up. Judas is the man that sits here at the front of the canvas. His face is turned completely away from the audience at all, and he's not looking at the audience. We get the back of his head. Let's see if I can. I'll underline him here for you. This guy here. So then I always ask my students, do you think Leonardo da Vinci was successful at communicating the inner intention of the man, based on the fact that you could or couldn't find Judas? Interesting things about this painting. It has an interesting history in that it's really been, the building that it's been housed in has been through a lot. Let me show you the next slide. It's a panned out version of the Last Supper. Hold on. So the last video gave you quite a bit of information about Leonardo da Vinci's The Last Supper. And I just want to sort of break down a few of the things that I said so that you can more clearly understand Da Vinci's technique and the things that were so miraculous about this painting. First of all, this painting had a lot of symbolism in it. We know that the Italian artists had seen the oil paintings that were done in the Netherlands in the early Northern Renaissance time. So we know that he saw Van Eyck.
That happened because of the Portinari altarpiece. And they were inspired by the symbolism that came from the Northern European artists. And so they want to imbue this symbolism into their paintings, but they do it on a much more, um, it's a more intellectual level to some degree. Instead of them being objects that are linked to sayings or objects that stand for something, they're symbols that are imbued into their theology. And so you see that Da Vinci groups everybody into groups of three. This is a symbol for the Holy Trinity. In this image, I'm showing you exactly the different groups of three. But he also has a group of seven, and that is the large, well, if you count each group of three as one, 2, 3. Oh, wait a minute. I'm sorry. There is a numerology of 7 in here. I would have to go back and look it up to show you, but Jesus is the one that makes the 7th person. So we know that in Christianity, numerology is significant in terms of 3, 4, and 7. And so we know that numerology was highly imbued into this painting, specifically with groups of 3, and with Jesus being the 7th, the image that's connected to the number 7. Also, he uses the new Italian 1-point perspective. So this painting's highly innovative. It takes everything that the Northern Renaissance artists were doing and uses that technology, but it also takes all of the new Italian technology with the perspective. So you can see how all of the receding lines converge at Jesus's head, making Jesus important, or the most important thing in the image. Additionally, in terms of them taking all of the innovation, Da Vinci wants to use the innovation of oil paints, and we're going to see how that plays out here momentarily. Okay, I wanted to give you a close-up of how Da Vinci shows the inner intention of the man. So I told you in the beginning that what Da Vinci does in terms of realism, is to show the inner intention of the man's soul. That was his desire. He felt like if he could show the inner intention of the man's soul, then he was showing ultimate realism. I mean, aside from the fact that this is a fresco painting and the people are very realistic looking, you have realism that is so real that they look just like any everyday, ordinary human being. The inner intention of the man's soul was communicated through gesture and facial expression. In this image, you can see that the men on the end, this is the right-hand side of the table, are conversing. They're talking about what Jesus has just said. This is the moment in which Jesus says, "One of you will betray me." And so he's conveying that through gesture and through their emotional conversation. So this image shows you what was left over from the original painting versus what was reconstructed. So in the original, or the slide that I showed you, the entire Last Supper, I told you that the painting has a bit of a sordid past in terms of history. It survived many bombings, and the first thing that it survived that was really traumatic for it had to do with the French Revolution. Napoleon used the refectory as horse stables during the French Revolution. I can't give you a picture of it because there wasn't a camera at the time. However, this image gives you a good idea of what they had to reconstruct after the bombing of World War II. So everything that you see here
that looks like brand new, fresh white plaster. That is all brand new post World War II building. The things that you see that are in color, those are things that were actually preserved after the bombing from antiquity, whenever the church was originally created. So you can see that they were able to save the painting itself, and they were able to save a little bit of the walls of the refectory, but that's about it. So the fact that the painting actually survived, it was a miracle upon itself. This image shows you how they protected the painting so that it did survive. They built a wall of sandbags and then braced the sandbags and braces so that they could protect the wall. And you can see in this image is from the Getty Studios. It's a picture that was put in the paper after the bombing of Milan during World War II. And you can see how much destruction was done to the church. The bell tower actually survives quite intact, but the rest of the monastery was pretty much gone. So I want to talk to you a little bit about the restoration of the painting. If we go all the way back to Da Vinci's time, I told you that Da Vinci was a very innovative painter. He was so innovative that he wanted to use the materials that he saw coming out of the Northern Renaissance painters. He knew that those oil paints themselves gave the artist the ability to create a very realistic figure that had great detail in it. And he wanted to capture that detail. And he thought, what if I could do that in my fresco? And so he paints the painting with oil paint. Unfortunately, this is an experiment that really doesn't work. Oil and water separate whenever they cure, or whenever the painting get cured, and the whole thing bubbled up. And 3 years later, he had to go back and completely repaint the entire thing, or repaint most of it. From there, because of the painting's past and having lots of traumatic things happen in its wake, there were some restorations that happened that really sort of changed our understanding of what Leonardo da Vinci originally intended when he painted this painting. First and foremost, there was a restoration that was done in the 1970s. And that restoration in the 1970s, some historians feel that the restoration changed the painting, that not a lot of Da Vinci's original intentions are there. The restorer went in and painted over top of Da Vinci's work. That's what we restorers do. They learn how to create chemical processes that were done in antiquity so that they can restore the work to its original splendor. And so when she restored the work, she believed that there was a woman sitting at Jesus's left-hand side. And she thought that the original painting had Jesus's mouth open instead of Jesus's mouth closed. And there were some things that happened with Jesus's hands that we don't know whether or not they were Da Vinci's original design. So, in recent years, in order to learn about Da Vinci's painting, they've done some studies. You can see the woman on the right-hand side. She's using a laser camera. That laser camera is analyzing the paint and analyzing the information underneath the plaster so that they can get a better understanding of what Da Vinci really intended when he painted the Last Supper. Now, the paintings that we're doing in terms of restoration are digital. So digital technology has allowed us to preserve the original chemical composition
and not alter it in any way, shape, or form, but also try to understand what the Last Supper actually looked like in antiquity. That restoration process has been a very fascinating one. It's been an enlightening process. And if it's something that you're interested in, I encourage you to scan this QR code that's here. The QR code will take you to an article that walks you through the digital restoration process. It will also tell you a lot about what they've discovered Da Vinci's original painting had in it. Last but not least, this is Da Vinci's original, or this is the restored digital restoration of the Last Supper. You can see that the ceiling has depth to it. In the original, we don't get to see those recessed coffers. That's the squares in the ceiling quite as clearly. You get a very clear understanding of what that woman to the left of Jesus's side looked like. You get an understanding of how Da Vinci used gesture and body position to convey the intention of the man, more so because you get a very clear understanding of what the facial features looked like. Judas is completely turned away from the canvas to the point where you can't see hardly any of his face. It's not just the back of his head, but you can only see about maybe an eighth of his face. And that was important because it was what conveyed that he is Judas, along with the bag of silver that he holds in his hand.
So from the fame of the Last Supper, Leonardo da Vinci ends up with a lot more commissions, one of them being the Mona Lisa, also one of the most iconic works of art in the history of art. The Mona Lisa, believe it or not, is not very large. It's only about the size of 2 sheets of paper. It has a front and a back. A lot of people don't realize it has a back side. The back side has a still life on it. It's painted on a wood panel with oil paint, and so typically a Renaissance artist would paint the back of the panel just to give it some visual interest. If you go to the Louvre today, the Mona Lisa is sandwiched in between 2 pieces of glass, and you can see the front and back side of the painting. It's also housed in this. It's housed inside a large wall made of hickory. It's a light color blonde wood. The room is really big to accommodate quite a few visitors to the museum, and the wall that was created to hold the Mona Lisa is really large. It runs the length of the entire room. Honestly, when you get there, you're really expecting something spectacular because it is the Mona Lisa after all, and it's a little underwhelming because it's so small and because the crowd is so big that you can hardly get to it. My suggestion, if you ever go to the Louvre to see the Mona Lisa, is get there early so that you can actually see what you're there to see. The paintings in the room around the Mona Lisa are actually the more fascinating of the works of art. But let's talk a little bit about the Mona Lisa itself. We know that the sitter for the portrait was a wife of a lawyer, but we don't know that much about her. She was of no particular social standing. She would have been in the upper middle class, but she wasn't royalty or anything like that. Leonardo breaks some conventions of portraiture that had been established in the early Renaissance with this particular work of art, and so that's really why the Mona Lisa is so famous. It's because Leonardo painting it changed the face of portraiture forever. Before the Mona Lisa, the Italians liked to paint people in the side profile view as opposed to a front profile view. At some point, people realized that no one is painted in a flattering light through a side profile view. In fact, Van Eyck knew that, and that's why he painted the three-quarter profile. The Mona Lisa is a little bit more than three-quarter profile because you can fully see all of the front part of her face. She sits for Leonardo with her knees directed at a wall and her torso turned to parallel the picture plane. That pose becomes a standard of portraiture that's used even today. He crosses her arms over top of a table that she is parallel with, and so he lays her hands one on top of the other. He doesn't paint a wedding ring of any sort, so we don't think that this was a particular portrait for a husband or something of that nature. It may have been that she was the wife of a lawyer who the wife passed away in childbirth, but we don't know for sure. Da Vinci creates a new technique called sfumato. It's S-F-U-M-A-T-O. It's an Italian word that means smoky. You can see the sense of smoky and haziness on her face in the jawline and at the edges of the eyes. The background of the portrait also has this light veiling to it, and Leonardo is famous for these hazy, unnatural looking landscapes that he puts behind his portraits. They're places that don't seem real, and they seem sort of mystical. We don't know why he preferred those type of landscapes, but he did. And they sort of make the sitter stand out a little bit more. He was very good at textures. You can tell that by looking at the Mona Lisa's dress and the texture of her hair. Having a tall forehead was a mark of beauty at this time. With this particular portrait, we are looking at the ideal beauty, or the ideal feminine beauty in Italy in the 16th century. There's been much speculation about who the person in the portrait is, mostly because Leonardo da Vinci never gave the portrait to the people who commissioned it. Some speculated that she was his lover, and that when she sat for the portrait, they fell in love through the art contact, and that he never ended up giving it up because he was in love with her. But that's just a rumor. We don't really have any proof of that. This is Da Vinci's The Vitruvian Man. He drew the Vitruvian Man after he read a book from the philosophies of an ancient Egyptian philosopher. The Vitruvian Man links the human body's proportions to basic scientific geometric shapes like the square and the circle. And here, this is the idea that Da Vinci is just linking the humanist idea that man was created by God, and that nature is reflected in the harmony of mathematics, and therefore man is a creation of logic and reasoning.